Hi guys, this is Mr. Y. Today we're going to be talking about chemical bonds. So if you're choosing to use this video as a tutorial for your graphic organizer, you can do that. But otherwise, this should be your basic introduction for biology into the chemical bonds you need to know. So on this page here, you can see the basic vocabulary we're going to go over today, and we'll highlight some of the more important ones in just a few minutes. So the learning objectives, you're going to learn about the four major types of chemical bonds after figuring out what a chemical bond actually is. And we're also going to learn about this weird term called electronegativity. So a chemical bond is an attraction between atoms from the sharing of electrons or by a complete transfer of electrons. Chemical bonds almost always involve charges of some type and or electrons. So the four types you need to make sure you know: covalent, which is non-polar covalent chemical bonds, sometimes referred to. Usually we just say covalent. 2, polar covalent, slight twist to the first type. And then 3, hydrogen bonds, and then 4, ionic bonds. So let's get started with covalent bonds. So covalent bonds are bonds formed from the equal sharing of pairs of electrons, and I've highlighted the idea that this is working in pairs of electrons, and remember, the little E symbol here means electrons. And that the goal with all covalent bonding is to have a full valence shell of electrons. Remember, we talked about valence shell last time in the atomic model introduction. So we want to have the valence shell completely full of electrons if at all possible. So for instance, we have hydrogen atom here. It has 1 proton, no neutrons, and then 1 electron. So you can see that right here, there's 1 space missing. And you can see that that shell, that's the first shell, can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. So it would like it very much if it could have that valence shell full of electrons. So how many more electrons does it need in order to be full? Well, that should be a simple question. It just needs 1 more to go. Very simple. And because of that little notion, hydrogen likes to bond with a lot of things. It only needs 1 electron. So the weird analogy of today's lesson, and it is a kind of weird analogy, imagine instead of feeling full after you eat, that the only way you felt full was to stand next to your best friend. That was the only way you could actually feel internally satisfied. That's kind of how this works with covalent bonding. The only way these guys get that extra electron is a lot of times by sharing electrons. That's what a covalent bond is. So here's a picture of 2 hydrogen atoms sharing each of their electrons. So they both technically have 2 electrons in their outer valence shell, that first shell, but they have to share, and because of that, they're much more chemically stable. So here's how you would show it with the Lewis dot structure, and these 2 dots, the top one and then the bottom one, would then be written out in a more accurate way with this little dashed line. So the dashed line represents a single covalent bond. Again, these are non-polar. We'll talk about polar covalent bonds in just a minute. So each dash represents a pair of electrons, 2 electrons being shared. And sometimes atoms will actually share more than a single electron. They'll share multiple electrons. So oxygen loves to bind to itself. The oxygen you breathe into your lungs actually comes in the form of O2, this guy, which is actually 2 oxygens sharing 2 pairs of electrons for a total of 4 electrons being shared between them. So you get 2 lines. And then nitrogen, the nitrogen gas that's also in the atmosphere, the one that actually makes up most of the atmosphere, actually likes to share 3 pairs of electrons with itself. It's sharing a total of 6 electrons, so you can draw it with, down here, 6 dots or 3 lines, and the little chemical formula is just N2. That's a triple covalent bond. So you can have single covalent bonds, double covalent bonds, and triple covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are usually the strongest and most important type of chemical bond we will be dealing with at this course. The others, I'll talk about their relative strengths in comparison to covalent bonds. So here we have 2 oxygen atoms, and you can see that they both have 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons in their valence shell, their outer shell, which is the second shell, this guy here, which can actually hold 8. So in order for them to feel full, as it were, and to be chemically stable, they each need 2 more electrons. And as I said before in the last slide, the way they do this is they end up sharing the pairs of electrons, and they share 2 pairs. That's why oxygen gets that double line for the double covalent bond. So we're going to go through a few more examples of types of covalent bonds and how you might occasionally see them. The first one again is just hydrogen. That's just a simple single covalent bond. Fluorine, which is a very reactive element, reacts with a lot of things, also usually likes to react with itself and share a single pair of electrons, so again that's a single bond. Carbon dioxide, a very common pollutant from exhaust and what you respire out through your lungs, what you breathe out, is actually a combination of 2 oxygens and 1 carbon, and the bonding between them is a double pair of electrons. You can see here there's 2 pairs there, 2 pairs there. So 2 electrons for every bond. In this case, they're sharing a total of 8. Carbon tetrafluoride is also a pollutant, but you can see here it's got 4 single covalent bonds, and there's a nice little brief animation showing these are 2 fluorine atoms, again showing this nice single bond they set up between themselves. So that's these guys. So this is kind of a Lewis dot model. I hyped it a little bit just so we can see how these arrange together. Again, this is the same exact molecule. This is methane, and again, each little line here represents a sharing of a single pair of electrons. Here's water. We're going to talk a lot more about water throughout the semester because it is a very important chemical for life, and so you have to understand that water, being composed of H2O, also uses covalent bonds, but they're not exactly the same type of covalent bonds. That'll be our next type of covalent bond we'll talk about, called polar covalent. But you can see it's a single bond, single pair of electrons that are shared between each hydrogen and the oxygen. So right here and here you can see the electrons being shared. And again, here's some more examples. We've seen hydrogen and oxygen already, and then there's water, and then there's methane. So let's go on to our second type of chemical bond. This is polar covalent bonds. Now these are covalent bonds, so the electrons are being shared, but with polar covalent bonds, the electrons are not being shared evenly. That's because some of the atoms get kind of greedy, for lack of a better description. So I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison with the first style we learned, which we're now going to call non-polar covalent bonds. Sometimes we just say covalent bonds, but if we don't tell you they're polar, just assume they're non-polar. So these are just regular old covalent bonds that we just learned about. A good example for this is methane gas, CH4. It has just plain, simple, single bonds between the carbon and 4 hydrogens. The electrons are shared nice and evenly. On the other side, we have water, which is actually a polar covalent molecule. And it's polar covalent because the oxygen does not like to share the electrons equally. The oxygen likes to have the electrons closer to its own nucleus. So the electrons feel a stronger force towards the nucleus of the oxygen than they do towards the nucleus of either of the hydrogens. So you get these little symbols on either end of the water. The oxygen gets this little symbol that just means slightly negative. The hydrogen gets slightly positive, and then slightly positive over here, because remember, electrons are what are being shared. Electrons are negative, so as the oxygen pulls the electrons towards itself, it's becoming slightly negative. Now, a compound will be a polar covalent compound if there is a large difference in a term we call electronegativity. Basically, you can think of electronegativity like strength. Electronegativity is the individual power of an atom to pull the electrons towards itself. So if you have 2 different atoms and one's a lot stronger in pulling electrons, it's probably going to be polar covalent. And the rating system for electronegativity runs on a scale of 0 to 4. The highest one is fluorine at 9.8, and the lowest one is francium at 0.7. Fluorine is over here in the periodic table. Francium is down over in this area here on the periodic table. So a stronger atom trying to covalently bond with a much, much weaker atom will probably be polar covalent. If the atoms have about the same electronegativity, they probably won't be. They'll probably just be regular covalently bonded. So back to the methane gas, you can see hydrogen is rated at 2.2 for its electronegativity, carbon at 2.5. That's only a 0.3 difference. So they share the electrons fairly equally, whereas hydrogen, again, still at 2.2, with the oxygen is 3.4 now. And on a 0 to 4 scale, remember you're dealing with the 0 to 4 scale for electronegativity, that's a pretty big difference. So the oxygen is pulling the electrons towards itself, and you get the slight negative charge. Quick word of warning on some of this before I continue. A lot of times you can see chemical models drawn like this, where they show the carbons, the hydrogens, and then you have an oxygen on the top, and then the chlorine. But a lot of times we like to save time. So to save time, a lot of times what chemists will do is they'll simplify their drawings. So this is that exact same molecule. You'll notice they took out the hydrogens and they took out the carbons, because that's such a common thing in organic chemistry and any chemistry dealing with life, that a lot of times when you see just the straight lines, you assume, oh, it's a carbon atom at the center and it has hydrogens in excess, because carbon always likes to form 4 bonds. So you would have to assume that these excess bonds in this particular center spot here go into hydrogens. And again, we do that just to save time. Here's a very simple little chemical. It's not even that complex, really. It's called aspartame. It's a low-calorie sweetener used in many foods and drinks. And you can either draw the version on the left or the version on the right. Most chemists will go with the version on the right because it's just easier to draw. Again, they show the hydrogen if it's attached to an unusual atom like nitrogen, but if it's just a carbon atom, they ignore it. And they don't show most of the hydrogens in that case either if it's attached to carbon. Alright, on to the third type of bond. These are hydrogen bonds. Now, hydrogen bonds always use at least one type of atom, hydrogen, hence the name. And it really comes about from a result of a molecule being polarly covalently bonded in its own general formula. And let me show you what I mean. So here we have covalent bonds, and the dotted lines are the hydrogen bonds. So if it's a solid line, it's a covalent bond. If it's a dotted line, it's a hydrogen bond. So those are covalent. These are the hydrogens. Hydrogen bonds are pretty weak by comparison to covalent bonds. They're only about 1/20th the strength of a covalent bond. So on their own, not very strong at all. The thing is, hydrogen bonds can occur in huge numbers because hydrogen is everywhere. It's in water, it's in your DNA, it's in your cells. It's a huge part of your chemical makeup. So it's not that the hydrogen bonds are all that strong, it's that they can form in the range of millions upon millions of hydrogen bonds. We'll talk about that in a minute. So hydrogen bonds are actually part of the reason why we see kind of interesting properties in life, such as ice, solid water floating in its liquid form. That's kind of backwards to what you would expect to happen. And hydrogen bonds are also responsible for holding your DNA together. So here's a quick little animation showing 2 different water molecules, and you can see the white is the hydrogen, the red is the oxygen, and the hydrogen, as you can see in the little diagram down here, hydrogen, because it's slightly positive, remember water is polar covalently charged within itself, because the hydrogen here is slightly positive, it's attracted to the slightly negative of other water molecules in the top case. That's water. Here, this is NH3, so that's some kind of ammonia molecule. So the slightly negative and slightly positive charges like to attract each other. Here's another animation showing you the same basic idea. These are all water molecules forming hydrogen bonds. And the thing is, when water is in liquid form, this usually doesn't happen. But when you slow down water molecules, when you make them stay at a much slower rate by lowering the temperature, this does happen quite easily. With DNA, we find hydrogen bonds all the way through the center of DNA strands. So every cell of your body, which has 46 chromosomes and is about 6 meters long when you actually stretch out the chromosomes, has nothing but hydrogen bonds holding the two sides of the DNA together. So like I said, hydrogen bonds are weak, but when they come in large numbers, they are very, very strong as a group. So hydrogen bonds or H bonds holding the two sides of DNA together. As I said before, hydrogen bonds can form between individual water molecules. So again, the dotted line here are the hydrogen bonds. And this is what gives water some of its more unique properties, the ability for water to stick together so well. So the ability of water molecules to form hydrogen bonds is what allows it to have two unique properties, adhesion and cohesion. Adhesion is the ability of water to stick to other surfaces, and then cohesion is the ability of water molecules to stick to themselves, to other water molecules. And that is what gives water its interesting property of surface tension, allowing things like this little lizard here and these little water striders to go on top of the water and actually not break the surface tension of the water, to actually appear to be walking on water. Now, as I said before, when you actually slow water molecules down and they're allowed to form these weird bonds with themselves, it actually leaves space. And because of that, that space right in here, this little space, is where air can get in. And we call this whole system a lattice structure, like a lattice fence. And it's actually the reason why ice can float in liquid water. Because remember, ice is just solid water. And with any solid substance, you expect it to sink in the liquid form. So if you have gold, and you have liquid gold and a brick of gold, you take that brick of gold and you put it into liquid gold, you expect that brick, solid, to sink in the liquid. Water doesn't behave that way because it has all these pockets of air. It has these pockets of air because the water molecules have arranged themselves in such a way into this lattice structure because of the hydrogen bonds, and which you can then again trace back to the fact that water is polar covalent between its own hydrogen and oxygen atoms. So the hydrogen bonds in the ice are much more ordered because the water molecules have been slowed down than they are in the liquid. In the liquid, the water is just moving too fast. The hydrogen bonds might form, but they'll break apart just as easily. So you can see here on the right, this is liquid, and this is solid, or in other words, ice. Now, the fourth type of chemical bond we're talking about today is ionic bonds. These form because of the attractions between two fully formed ions, either a positive cation or a negative ion. This comes about because of a transfer of an electron entirely. So we're not talking about sharing of electrons now. Now we're talking about an entire movement of one electron from one atom to another. So this little diagram on the left is what I'm going to work with first. It shows a sodium atom, and you can see it has just one valence electron. Now, instead of actually trying to fill up all these other electrons in the shell, what it can do is actually donate. They use the word donate, that's a nice way of saying it. Donate its electron to chlorine, and you can see chlorine only needs one more electron to have a full valence shell. And when it does that, the chlorine gets a full valence shell, and the sodium loses that outer shell, and now its outer shell, down here, just has a full layer. And so does chlorine. But now, because remember, electrons are negatively charged, the chlorine has a negative charge, and the sodium has an extra proton in the nucleus now because it's not balanced. And now you have a positive and a negative, and they tend to attract each other. They are ions. So here it is in just much more simplified version. You have the Na, this is in Lewis dot form, the sodium with the one electron, the chlorine with the 7, it needs one more. So the electron, I use the word stolen, but it doesn't matter. You can say donated, stolen. It's stolen from the sodium to the chlorine takes it, and now the ions form. The sodium becomes positive, the chlorine becomes negative, and because you have one positive and a one negative, they tend to stick together. The electrical attraction between them is pretty strong. NaCl you should recognize as table salt. Here's another quick animation of this process happening. Notice that in this animation, the ions form and then they stick together. Again, once the electron moves from the sodium to the chlorine, the negative charge forms on the chlorine, the positive charge forms on the sodium. Now, ionic bonds happen a lot in nature, and their strength, well, the strength really depends upon the electronegativities of the different atoms. So the best way I can talk about the strength is to show it a little bit graphically. It's not perfectly like this, but it's close. So the bigger the difference in electronegativities up here between the two atoms we're talking about, in say, sodium and chlorine, the stronger the ionic bond will be. If the difference between their strengths and electronegativities is lower, the lower the strength of the ionic bond will be. So that's it for now, guys. Make sure you ask questions if you need help on understanding any of this. Bring your notes to look at if you need to. Next up, we're going to be talking about the major types of biochemical molecules we find in use in cells.